Northern Russia had escaped by what they call good luck. The powerful merchants' Republic of Novgorod had made no attempt to aid the cities in the Ryazan region, perhaps because the merchants were willing to see their rivals destroyed, more probably because they had no inclination to march out to their own city-state of breweries, bees, and forests by the edge of Lake Ilmen near the Baltic. The free men of Novgorod had carried on a prosperous trade with the German Hanseatic ports, quarreling and fighting sturdy little duels with the Swedes and the Teutonic Knights, who competed with them for the northern fur trade. From the edge of the Baltic south, the militant Germans were pressing against the Slavs with the smaller peoples, Poles and Lithuanians. Caught between the greater masses, the Prussians were, at that time, what they called savages, the lawful prey for slaughter or conversion of the Teutonic Knights. This centuries-long conflict of Germans and Slavs for possession of the eastern marches of Europe was interrupted brutally by the Mongols. Batu's division made Novgorod from Run, Pereyaslav. By then, the snow had gone, and the invading horsemen found themselves in a labyrinth of swamps and dense forest growth. By rare fortune, the Novgorodians, it rained almost continually that spring and summer. The wet and lack of grazing worked hardship on the Mongol horsemen, accustomed to the almost rainless prairies of High Asia. Before they sighted Lake Ilmen, they turned back, wearied by the constant rain. Within 60 miles of wealthy Novgorod, Batu turned back by Subutai's advice. That experienced general realized that he had forced his divisions through a hard campaign in the midwinter cold. Their horses were in bad condition, so he turned all the units of his army to the south, leaving only guard detachments in the ravaged central Russia. Now he had need of the good grazing in the southern steppes. Moreover, the Mongols had discovered that the Slavs of the cities were unlike the Asiatic nomads. They would not or could not be drafted into the mountain regiments of the Ordu. To learn the Mongol method of warfare, they were useful only as sappers and laborers. The Mongols, therefore, would have to make their attack on the next zone of resistance without Russian conscripts, and Subutai, the ever-cautious, took time to prepare for the next move. It took him longer than expected. In that summer of 1238, he followed the grass south, putting his horses in condition. Curiously, the Mongols explored the fertile steppes around the Black Sea. Here, where the grasslands stretched to the salt inlets, they discovered an ideal coast, sun-warmed, suitable for cattle. Some of them investigated the Crimea and came face to face with a strange variety of Christians. These spoke an unknown tongue. They wore no boots, and they lived by barter. Like the Arab caravan merchants, they proved to be Venetians, and since they did not appear in arms against the Mongols, they were not massacred. Instead, they bought Russian slaves and loot from the nomads. At the same time, Subutai's detachments penetrated the heights of the Caucasus far enough to establish contact with the other Mongol army of North Persia. The two commands, meeting after 4 years, exchanged information and parted. The Mongols were putting central Russia in order, methodically as usual. The Darugashi, the governor for the Khakan, estimated the yield of grain in the southern Black Earth region and the value of the furs, the sable, miniver, black, and silver fox and beaver that came out of the north. These and hides, and tallow, with the silver of the Ural region, and the human beings to be sold as slaves or kept to pay taxes, made up the wealth of Russia. Since he found almost no coined money in Russia, the Darugashi planned to have his new subjects pay a tax in beasts of the five kinds: sheep, horses, cows, oxen, and hogs. Already he'd begun with his Uyghur and Chinese secretaries the consensus of human souls, the building of granaries along the courier roads that did not exist as yet. He had established contact between this new empire of Batu and the court of the Khakan in the Far East. While this was going on, Subutai was delayed by something he could not prevent: friction between the members of the Golden Family. They had advanced nearly 1,000 miles from the old frontier of the Urals. They had won most of the Russian plain from Batu. Batu's golden tents and his numerous wives accompanied the army. It seemed to Kuyuk and to the sons of Chagatai that Batu had had enough of an empire already, but Subutai the inflexible would hear of no halt in the march toward Europe, nor would Kuyuk the unyielding consent to act as divisional general for the Sain Khan, the son of Bastard. Mangu, on the other hand, on Sirakuktiti's advice, was kind to Batu, and Mangu had been gaining victories in the fertile south. Mangu had conscripted a division of the strong Kipchak Turks, although the greater part of the Kipchaks, some 40,000 tents, had fled westward with their chieftain Kutyan headlong toward the rivers up to the Hungarian plain. This aged Kutyan knew the Mongols of old, and he put as much space between them and his people as he could. This escape of a powerful enemy who was certain to warn Europe of the coming attack by the Mongols irked Subutai, but Kuyuk and the unruly princes would pay no attention to his protests. They wanted to be back in Karakorum with the ailing Ogadai. Batu, in this crisis, called for a Kuriltai of the leaders of the army, only to be mocked by Kuyuk and his sympathizers, and Batu sent a message of protest to the Khakan in Karakorum. "O Khakan, my uncle, by the power of heaven," he wrote, "we have overcome the 11 nations. When the armies turned back, a feast was held for all the princes. I am the eldest, so I drank 1 or 2 cups of wine before the others. Then were Kuyuk and Buri angered. They rose from the feast and went out, mounting their horses. They abused me." Buri cried out, "Batu is in no way superior to me. Why does he drink before I drink? He is no more than an old woman with a beard. With one kick, I could knock him down and roll him over." Kuyuk said, "Nay, he is an old woman with a sword and armor. I shall order him to be beaten with a stick." And another one called out to fasten a wooden tail to my body behind. Such was the speech of these princes when, after the war with the difficult peoples of the West, we gathered to deliberate upon important matters, and we had to break up without discussing affairs at all. Such is my message to you, O Khakan, my uncle. After months, the riders of the horse post brought a reply from Ogadai. Indignant at this family dispute, which held up the work of conquest, the Khakan censured his son Kuyuk severely, adding that Buri and Baidar would be judged by Chagatai. As for you, Ogadai reminded Batu, do not boast so much of your victories. They were gained by Subutai. More than that, Ogadai recalled Kuyuk and Buri and the others. They left with their followers for the long trek back to the Gobi. But, being in no mood to be called to account before Ogadai, they went at a foot pace, hunting on the way. Batu, worried, would have followed. Mangu had heard from his mother that Ogadai had fallen sick, and the master of the Golden Horde wanted to protect his own interests, at least to return to his headquarters on the Volga. I cannot keep you from going, Subutai said to him, yet I will not turn aside until I have watered my horse in the Danube. Knowing that his own men would not follow him from the war, Batu had to stay with the 60-year-old general, but it seemed to him that they risked defeat by advancing. The immense area behind them held within it peoples who had been stunned but not destroyed by the Mongol inroads. The detachments Subutai had left to guard their communications, perhaps 50,000 men, did not number more than a fraction of the surviving population. He and Subutai could not have mustered more than 90,000 men for a new campaign. Besides, after the flight of the Kipchaks, Europe would be warned and armed and ready. For 2 years, the Mongols had delayed in the steppes north of the Don. Subutai, however, would not listen to objections. The court of the Golden Heads, Subutai struck again in December of 1240 of the Volga era, this time against Elder Russia, where trading centers had grown up around Kiev, the mother of cities. For centuries here, the southern Slavs had been in contact with the Byzantine culture, the Dnieper and Black Sea being the way to Constantinople. But here in the southwest, the prince was at feud with his rivals, and as in the devastated north, their neighbors gave them no aid. Mangu and Batu led this new invasion across the frozen Dnieper. The worried master of the Golden Horde and the silent son of Tului had become fast friends, and Subutai could not trust Batu to lead without a wiser head beside him. They were struck by the first sight of Kiev with its gilded domes and white walls reflected in the river, and they christened it the Court of the Golden Heads. Mangu had sent the Kievans the usual summons to submit, adding, "If you do otherwise, we know not what will happen. Only God knows." Recklessly, the city men slew the Mongol envoys, bringing the summons, and closed their gates when the first horsemen appeared, with the ruins of the river hamlets smoking behind them. "See how the little pigs," the Mongols laughed, "had gathered in their pen to be put to death." The capture of Kiev was followed by its utter devastation. The Russians ran from the wall into the churches, and the flat roof of one, crowded with people, caved in on the frantic multitude beneath. The great church of the Tithe was torn apart by the Mongols, only heaped up stones remaining on its site. The Byzantine mosaics and the treasures of the sanctuaries almost vanished. When Kiev was at last rebuilt, it was only a shadow, the chroniclers say, of the lost city. The Grand Prince Mikhail escaped toward Poland, but the charred bodies of his people lay unburied in the dismantled walls until the stench of them drove human beings from the place. After the fleeing nobles, the Mongols followed, driving the Kipchaks and Slavs ahead of them. Wives of the Barbarians, who had never worked with their hands, labored at grinding grain and watering the Mongols' horses. It was strange, a chronicler relates, to see those who had commanded servants doing the work of servants. The pursuit of the Mongols reached the barrier of the Carpathian Mountains and halted for a few days to rest the horses. Batu had a fondness for the Russians and wished to spare them. He admired one of the first captives, Oleg the Handsome, whose blue eyes and long yellow hair held something of a woman's charm. When Batu tried to caress Oleg, the Russian thrust him away, and in time Batu killed him. At the sack of Kiev, he had spared the bold Dmitri, called the Galician. Dmitri became his intimate and urged him to have nothing to do with the Western peoples. Yeah, having the guy killed because he wasn't gay, that's messed up. It's also, do you really have to destroy the churches? Deal with the people that were enemies, but, whether you agree with the churches or not, west of the Carpathians, Dmitri said militant frontiersmen would be met with people of the forests and the cities, proud kings and bishops, who were no less than kings, hosts of mail-clad knights and men-at-arms trained in war. Their monasteries and churches were to be seen as formidable as castles, swift rivers, now filling with the spring thaw, and dangerous marshlands, and towns strengthened by citadels. All these would be obstacles to the Mongol horsemen. Moreover, the inhabitants of this Middle Europe were accustomed to make war for the glory of their god, so they thought. Slavs beyond the Dnieper, Poles, Dur, Croats, and Magyars, Bohemians, Hungarians, aided by the Teutonic Knights and French Templars, who had come to serve against the invaders. Pagan and heathen before Christian, it was just they were material culture references. Infidel, people who cheated on their wives and stuff, and betrayed their trust and that sort of thing. It wasn't, and Gentile too. I'm not, going to justify people who use those terms for people who are just of different faiths. And until 1967, of course, the Catholic Church considered all monotheists to be pagans. And behind them, the twin powers of the German Emperor and the Church of Rome then engaged in a war of their own. The Mongols encamped outside the barrier of the Carpathians, were confronted by what was, until recently, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, with the southern Germans, Austrians, and Czechs. And behind these, the twin powers of the Third Reich and Italy. Now the Third Reich. Remember, this was written. This is written before the NSDAP. Well, I forget what that stands for. National Socialist. Anyways, the people they call the Nazis. This would have been like the Second Reich, or would have this been the Second Reich? And Italy. Anyways, these Europeans had ample warning of the Mongols' approach. They were mustering their armed strength as far away as Bohemia in the midwinter snows, but they were moving slowly and not united. They heard that a Mongol raiding detachment had penetrated as far as Sandomir in Polish territory to seize captives for information. Kutian's Kipchak tribesmen had described the Mongols and their method of warfare to the king of Hungary. The Kipchaks were in such fear of the Mongols that they consented to be baptized en masse by the Hungarians to join the army of that strong nation. It's better to actually have small numbers of people convert that are real, about it. Or midway numbers of people who, accept the faith more than other faiths. Moreover, Russian refugees thronging across the Galician plains, had come into the Polish courts with tales of the sack of Kiev. These tales grew in the telling until the Europeans assured each other that a horde of demons was on the march toward them. Well, weren't they trained in fighting each other and fighting other people on principle, basically? A certain Ivo of Narbonne wrote down gravely that these had the heads of dogs, and that after they had fed upon the bodies of the dead, vultures would not touch the bones. Young and lovely women, Ivo added, after being ravished by the dog-headed Mongols, had their breasts torn open and were kept for dainty eating thereafter. Well, it shows what sort of sickness these people had if they, A friar Julian had made 2 journeys into Russia and had written to his bishop, Salvius of Pérouse, that the Mongols would move against Germany, that they talked of conquering Rome and the lands beyond, but of the true nature of the invaders, of their method of warfare and their purpose, the Europeans were ignorant. Like the Russians, they trusted blindly in their ability to defeat any numbers of non-Christians. They paid no attention to the formal letter Batu wrote to Bela, king of the Hungarians. For one reason, it was written in the Uyghur script, and no one at the court could read it, but the Kipchaks could read it. And the same Friar Julian had it read to him. It had a consequence, amusing as we look back on it, but grim enough at the time. It was, in fact, a Mongol trick. "I am Sign," it began, "the messenger of the Lord of the Sky, the Khakan, who has the authority over the earth. He has given me power to raise up those who submit to me, and to crush those who defy me. I am surprised that you, King of Hungary, have paid no heed to the envoys I sent to you. It may anger you to submit, yet it is best to do so. So far the routine summons to surrender to Mongol rule. Now follows the barb. Word has come to me that you have taken the Kipchak, our servants, under your protection. Cease harboring them, or you will make of me an enemy because of them. They, who have no houses and dwell in tents, will find it easy to escape, but you, who dwell in houses within towns, how can you escape from me?" Now Batu had interpreters enough about him. A little later he even sent a message by a captured Englishman who spoke 7 languages. He could have had the letter written in Russian or Hungarian. Instead, he used a script that only the Kipchaks could read. And this was not by accident, because after the campaign he wrought more deviltry by letter when he got possession of Bela's state seal. The natural consequence was that the Hungarians suspected that he was sending a secret message to the Kipchak Khan, who actually desired nothing more than to stand with the Hungarians against the Mongols. This led to the rumor that the Mongols had sent the Turkish Kipchaks on ahead to betray the Hungarians. Then it was discovered that the letters stated that the tribesmen would escape, while the Europeans who dwelt in houses would be exterminated. A worthy Austrian archduke who had volunteered for the campaign was impelled to kill the Khan of the Kipchaks and throw his head out of a window. The net result was that the Kipchaks, who would have been valuable allies, fled to the mountains and raided the Hungarians like wolves. The Ride of the 4 Columns. It was then February 1241 of the Common Era. Subutai and Batu were resting their horses in the Galician plain outside the barrier of the Carpathians, questioning the captives brought from Sandomir. Subutai has learned much from spies and the obliging Venetian merchants. He and his commanders have pieced together out of this information an exact picture of the lands that lie ahead of them and the human forces gathering to oppose them. Subutai assures Batu that it will not be safe to hold the Russian plain unless this strength of Middle Europe is broken. Batu is doubtful because they are going against the odds of 2 and 3 5-1, and defeat in the west would be disastrous to him. Subutai is counting upon speed to avoid defeat. The Mongol horses can maneuver at a speed that is 2 or 3 times that of the enemy. His plans to divide his army into 4 columns to break through and around the line of the Carpathians. His 4 columns will be able, he believes, to find and obliterate the Christian points of mobilization. In this march, or rather headlong ride, they will meet again at the point where the main European strength is gathering. At Pest, on the Danube, some of them, at least, will get there if they keep up their pace. Because Batu is doubtful, Subutai keeps the Sane Khan with him in command of the main body. The flanking columns he gives to the impetuous warriors, Kaidu and Kadan. Mangu has been recalled to Kurum. His timetable calls for his columns to arrive at the rendezvous on the Danube on March 17th. He sends the Mongols of the right flank column off first in the beginning of March. This is a strong division with some 30,000 riders under the command of Kaidu. It has, beside the longest circuit to make to the north around the Great Arc of the Carpathians. Here the snow is already leaving the ground. For the first week, the flying column moves slowly, passing through Sandomir, ruined by the Mongols' winter raid. Dividing into 2, it feels for the first resistance and finds the Poles gathering too. The standard of Boleslas the Chaste, with the Slavs of Prince Ekeslas. The Mongols, in close formation, attack at Szydlo, separating the 2 commands of the Polish army. They drive Mieczyslas with the survivors of his Slavs to the west, while Boleslas flees south toward the mountains. This is March 18th.